All right, now we've got our next speaker, Andrew Brown. I'll just tell you a little bit about him. He completed an undergraduate degree or degrees in the USA before returning to Australia to undertake Bible college teaching and youth camp ministry. After Andrew married, he joined a pastoral team at a Baptist church and began research studies at the University of Queensland. He did 6 years of country pastoring at that place in rural northeastern New South Wales. And soon after his arrival at MST, he completed his PhD thesis in the reception history of the creation week in Genesis. Andrew is married and has three teenage children, and he plays the guitar like all good Christian men. And today he'll be talking on misunderstanding Genesis 1 to 3 when the translation train jumps the tracks.
Thanks, everyone. My approach to speaking, I sort of get bored if I read my own script, so I just sort of speak to the presentation, so hopefully we'll be okay with the presentation. When I speak, it tends to be like one of those armoured water cannon vehicles in a dictatorship, kind of put out way too much and everyone just sort of copes with the amount of liquid they can handle, and then the rest just goes on the street. So catch something if you can. The purpose of this is really to go back to sort of a bare bolts aspect of Genesis, given that oftentimes when we're trying to understand origins and what our Bibles mean for us, we're thinking about the early chapters of Genesis. They're so seminal and foundational. And so my idea is to hit 7 terms in the Hebrew text without naturally requiring Hebrew knowledge as much as possible. That just can get in the way when we don't understand the nuances. Whenever you translate, you lose something in translation. So this is the purpose. And forgive me when I improvise as I watch the time, because it's nearly 11 o'clock and we're going to go to bed. So the 7 terms are in the beginning, the very first term of Genesis 1:1, and I'll touch on a couple of others, the wind or the spirit in Genesis 1:2, Eretz, land or earth in Genesis 1:1, and the word for human or Adam that occurs multiple times a bit later on. In the day, the word yom or day occurs a lot of times, but there's a phrase in the day that can be kind of seminal. So I'll start explaining the first one. So the very first word of the Bible, in the beginning, and if you've got a digital Bible there, it's just interesting to see whether you have alternatives to that. Does anyone have their Bible on their phone there and have something different from in the beginning in your translation of choice? So there it is in its Hebrew glory. Does anyone have anything different from in the beginning? Okay, so some of you might have something along the lines of when God began to create. Okay, so I'm just going to bring up the options. If in the beginning is the correct translation for this term, Bereshit, it could mean a first step in creation, and that's probably how I grew up thinking about it in the early stages. Okay, this is the first, in the beginning God created heavens and earth, and then what followed was the rest of the narrative. The alternative is that this phrase could introduce a subordinate construction, which means at this time period, when God began to create, this was the situation. It tends to subordinate verse 1 to verse 2 and emphasise that verse 2 is initial conditions. Okay, then the world was wild and waste, some people translate, or formless and empty. There's a couple of subvariants here. One of them is that verse 2 is the main clause, the land was formless and empty. And an alternative is that the main statement is in verse 3. Then God said, let there be light. Now, there's our old medieval rabbi on both sides of that sub-alternative, but the idea of that standing independently was the dominant tradition for a good 1,000 years or so. And most popular these days is that this initiates a summary of creation that's not a first step, but actually tells you this is what this entire story is going to be about. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Oh, so now let's have the detail. First, verse 2 would say, here's the situation when God began to create. I've used the other phrasing, but here's the situation when the story begins, but the story only begins in verse 3, where a certain verb form initiates. So, and then God said, that's actually the first event in the storyline. I think that's probably now the dominant interpretation, and that would be my understanding. I'm in the process of kind of looking for parallel examples in Genesis where we can see that narratives work that way, with a heading statement and then the development of the story. There's an example in Genesis 28:10 where Abraham, the Hebrew actually says he just goes to Syria, he goes to Aram, and then an event happens on the way in the subsequent narrative. And so many of our Bibles say, and Abraham set out for Syria, but actually the Hebrew just says, and he went. And so it has, in a sense, backtracked to give you the detail of what happened on the journey following that. So right in the very first word, I mean, if you wanted to pick a word from the Bible that has been more intensely discussed than probably any other word, I think this would probably have the most published literature, or maybe Logos in Gospel of John, that kind of thing. It's been intensely discussed. And a lot of that is really hidden behind the kind of English translation that you receive, the kind of victims of the translation we favour. So the topic with the second word, when it says God created heavens and earth, I think earth is up for debate as well. What do you imagine? What's your mental picture when you hear God created heavens and earth? What immediately comes to mind for you? We all have sort of...
The solar system. The solar system and the galaxies and us separate.
Yeah. I used to think that, well, when we capitalised Earth with a capital E, we meant the planet. And then when we just said the Earth, we were speaking more generally. But I did check Macquarie Dictionary, and it just says essentially those meanings are interchangeable. They're not distinguished. So I think when we think of Earth, we're imagining the globe, the sphere in solar system relationships. And that really leads us to over-import meaning into a term, considering that the original author kind of can't mean that because they don't have that available. It is possible to say God means more by what's been given to us in Scripture than what the human author was capable of doing. But if the human author is, by the miracles of inspiration, communicating way more than he or she is capable of expressing in the cultural terms of the time, then it's also way more than the audience of the time is capable of receiving. Okay, so this is our term, haaretz, and my suggestion here, this is where it turns up. My suggestion here is that really we're intended to be thinking of something along the lines of land. So if you've explored those Bible Project videos, they actually use land and sky for Genesis 1:1. And I think that's at least a really stimulating alternative. It doesn't mean that you start talking about, oh, well, Genesis 1 is just expressing a regional creation as opposed to all the planets. So it's just saying, oh, well, when God created like the Middle East, here's what he did. It's not to the exclusion of the rest of the world that we know. It just can't really comment on it. You're talking about a writer and audience that knew of a world that went out maybe to the other end of the Mediterranean on one hand and the Indian subcontinent on the other. So in a sense, it's saying land, whatever land there is. It's really not yet saying, I think, sphere, planetary sphere in orbital motion. It doesn't exclude it, it's just not really commenting on it. And so our translations, we just need to be more aware of what they evoke in our own minds when we make them. Some of you have had overseas experience and might have already thought through some of these issues of when you translate, you've got to go left or right on the possible nuances, and any choice you make excludes other options. So it's tough, isn't it? But I think thinking about it as land and sky, sky is more difficult because it shouldn't exclude the heavens of God's dwelling in a sense, but land versus earth, I think is worth considering. Once you get to Genesis 2 and the story of the creation of the human out of clay, now you're using a different word most of the time, Adama, ground, and it's very earthy, and it's got quite a different sense. It's like the dirt that you farm. Okay, so I think that's helpful with Eretz, just a few words in. The Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, was moving above the surface of the deep in verse 2. involves other difficult translation choices because each of these words has different possible senses, especially the first one, ruach. You might have even heard about this. If it doesn't mean spirit, it could mean what?
Wind,
Right?
breath.
Yeah, so I like to think of those three as the main three alternatives. Here's where it turns up. Something else I've imported into that bottom diagram, the light blue boxes along the top row represent the fact that the word for God in Genesis chapter 1 is Elohim. And then as soon as you hit Genesis 2 verse 4, it's a double-barreled word for God, Yahweh Elohim. There are various reasons why that is. When we are in just 1 verse 2, it's the spirit of Elohim. But we have to choose or try to elicit whether breath, wind or spirit out of the, being the most common choices is the nuance that we're after. And if your version says spirit, especially with a capital S, you might sort of feel like to even consider the meaning wind is kind of heretical, right? It's a sort of a theological downgrade. But in the early church, there's a significant sector of the church that had the opinion, committed Christians. These were the Syrian fathers and the Eastern fathers living out where Syria is now. They understood it to mean wind. That was their understanding. So it shows us that good people believed the different options and it wasn't just a question of, the godly people versus the heretics. And even if you are talking about spirit, in the Old Testament, you have to ask the question, are we talking about an influence from God, such as the spirit that comes from God and puts Saul in good or bad moods or frames of mind? That's, I think, a less personal use of the word. Is it an extension of the personality of God, but not really thinking, in Trinitarian terms? Or are we talking about kind of like the third person of the Trinity in a very developed form? It's tricky with Ruach because the Spirit of God moving over the waters, I think, probably deliberately plays with the different possible nuances of the meaning of the word. And so if you're operating in the original language, you can do that. An Israelite listener doesn't have to kind of press the writer to say, oh, when you said Ruach, are you meaning more of like a personal thing, or is it like a natural phenomenon, or is it part of God or expression? They don't actually have to, the author doesn't need to be pressed on that. He can use this term that has this polyvalence, these multiple possibilities, and kind of let the listener kind of dwell with the alternatives. They interchange. The same word is used in Exodus 15 in the poem about the victory at the Red Sea, where it says, the ruach of your nostrils drove back the sea. So is it the Spirit of God? Yeah, it sort of is. Is it the wind? Yes, it sort of is. It doesn't actually exclude the alternatives. It's the ruach of God that drives back the sea and lets the Israelites get across. So there's no one great translation alternative that lets us hold on to all the possibilities, but becoming aware of the fact that those are the alternatives helps us to get a fuller sense of what that term can do. Now, until we learn Hebrew, what can we do to achieve that kind of widening of our minds on a term like that? There is something we can do. What can we do?
Well, you can put all three in.
Now, say I hadn't told you about them, what could you do then?
Look for other occurrences of Ruach.
Yeah, and of course your computer software can help you with that, right? It can sort of search by original term, and also just...
Look at other English translations,
Yep.
see if someone else does it differently.
Exactly right, yep. If there's a really viable alternate translation, once you've compared, I'm being a bit silly, but 8 or 10, which you can easily do with software, one of them will use the alternative term if it's viable. And so you will get the odd one using the wind of God. Even the God part of this term could be like a hyper superlative, like an amazingly strong wind. There's a few examples in the Old Testament where Elohim is used that way. Because they're so rare, most translators would say, well, let's use wind of God or Spirit of God. It's probably meant to be personal like it is through the rest of the chapter. All right, so let's move on a little bit further then. Okay, there are some contextual occurrences that you can check. One interesting one is that the solution to the flood that comes at the beginning of chapter 8, the Lord sends his wind again, and the crisis and the judgment of the flood starts to be undone. And so if it's the Ruach Elohim that creates, originally it's the Ruach Elohim or the Ruach Adonai recreates in chapter 8. Okay, so when we get to rakia, this is an interesting one for the purposes of understanding, you know, science and Bible interaction. Rakia refers to classically the firmament of Genesis 1:6. We don't really have a good alternate word that's lodged in our English language. Firmament's awkward and old-fashioned, but at least when people were talking about firmament, they knew what they meant. So now we have to come up with an alternate translation because I haven't heard firmament in the word on the street for a while. And the question really is it sort of, I'll go down to, is it meant to be two-dimensional or three-dimensional? Is that the understanding, right? Let's bring up a little bit more. So, yeah, the question is, can I understand it as clouds? That would make a logical source. That's the waters above. They drop their water every so often. Okay, that's a good solution. That's not hard to explain to somebody. But we do face the difficulty, I think, of the fact that as you proceed to read through the chapter, the water is above this, whatever this firmament is, or whatever this, you know, two-dimensional layer, three-dimensional atmosphere, whatever's being understood. It's got water above it, but the luminaries are in it, judging by the Hebrew. And then the birds, some of our versions say that they're in it, but that's not the preposition you read in the Hebrew. It's against the face of it. Now, the preposition doesn't have to be quite that literal, but I take it to mean this side of it. So whatever this thing is, the birds are a little bit below it, just below it. The luminaries are in it, and then the water's on the other side. And so as much as it would make us comfortable to interpret this rakia as the clouds, I don't think you can do it because the sequence in the stack is wrong. And so that forces us to address the question of how do we handle the fact that Genesis 1 appears to involve an antique cosmology that doesn't quite correspond to the way that we see the atmosphere in the universe today. This can be overdrawn sometimes. I get a bit frustrated with those funny diagrams you see in some books about Genesis that show like a snow globe, right? A kind of a dome. It's got gaps in it, and they're the windows of heaven, and there's the storehouses for the hail and all this stuff out of the book of Job. It's been taken really literally, and so people will draw like little a locker room full of weather phenomenon, you know, ready to fall through the windows of heaven. And I think where that gets a bit silly is we kind of assume that Israelites couldn't speak metaphorically or use figurative language. Now, when you appreciate the rest of Old Testament's scripture and literature, you realise they're probably better at literature than we are today. The Old Testament is full of really high-grade writing. They could use figurative language. When they talked about the storehouses of heaven, they didn't always mean lockers, you know, they could actually speak figuratively. We've not only got to give them some credit, the more you read the Old Testament, the more you realise they're really cleverer than us on a lot of levels. But they didn't have the benefit of, you know, space shuttle missions, etc. We are going to have to compensate for the fact that the cosmology is not the same. Okay, and that's not to limit revelation, but it's no use God communicating the truth about creation to people using 21st century astronomy to, you know, 10th century BC or 15th, you know, whatever, however you want to date these texts. Using our cosmology to that audience makes no communicative sense when you're thinking about inspiration. Okay, so something like expanse or vault that's a little bit a flexible term is probably not a bad solution there. Moedim, I've called this an easy one up on the heading. It's not very complicated. This is the word for seasons. It just doesn't quite show up there, but in Genesis 1:14, when the heavenly lights are appointed, it says, let them be, in some versions, for signs and seasons and days and years. Something that gets lost in the word seasons is we think of seasons and we think of certainly astronomical movements and maybe agriculture, things like this. But this word has a different connotation. It really is thinking of the holy days. How will you know when the Feast of Pentecost should be? How will you know when the Feast of Trumpets should be in Passover? And if you've read any literature between Old Testament times and about 1800, the main reason you talk about the calendar is so that you know when to celebrate Easter on the right day, etc. But all the calendar science up till about 1600 is concerned with when is the right time to celebrate the holy days. The understanding is if you celebrate on the wrong day, it's not sacred, it doesn't work. The fact that we don't think that way doesn't mean that nobody ever did. So it's worth us knowing that the appointment of the heavenly lights on day 4 of creation, part of the purpose, as understood by a writer and audience, is so that worship can happen legitimately. And that gets a bit hidden if we're using the word season, right? We're just thinking very mechanically, naturalistically. And just as a side note, the word lights in Genesis 1:14 works much the same way. Okay, the word lights, it doesn't simply mean, you know, for illumination. It really signifies that they're there to, well, the same word is used for the illumination of the tabernacle later on. Let me just check how long I've got, Sarah.
Oh, 4 minutes.
Yes.
So we have a couple of questions. Yeah.
Sure. Yep. Okay. So I'm just going to talk about Adam, and I'll leave it there. And there are grammatical questions about when it has the article and when it doesn't. In Hebrew, if you say ha-Adam, the Adam, you're not talking about a person because you don't need the if it's a person's name, which is actually how we do it as well. No one says the Andrew. Most of the time in the early chapters of Genesis, this word turns up with the article, right? It's the Adam, all the way down really, with exceptions to 425. The only exceptions are ones that have this letter in front and they're debatable. So there are 3 debatable ones in the orange. All the rest have the article until 425. So we should really be treating it as not a name until 425. And we should probably translate it as human with a capital H once it is a name. And that would just remind us we're talking about a generic representative figure, right? It starts to double as a character in a storyline, but the representativeness is lost. So these are some of the things that come up in translation where translators have to make a decision, have to make a choice. We find ourselves limited by their choices when we don't know what those options are. So the more we can find out, the better. Thanks, Sarah.
Great, thank you, Andrew.
And I thought I might start off with one myself. Now, I'm a scientist, so I have to rely on people like you, theologians, to tell me about those first few chapters of Genesis. And I've always wanted to ask, I think I've asked the question, is there a good theological reason to believe that those first chapters of Genesis could be taken as literal history? Obviously, there are probably theologians out there that do believe that. Where do they go wrong? You can tell what I'm thinking, but yes, where do you think differences, I should say, not where they go wrong?
Yeah, something that came up in the earlier session was, I think we are not very well trained readers of literature very often. And so when you interpret a piece of writing in a genre that doesn't belong to it, you know, when you read a personal email as an essay, or when you read a financial document as a story, you know, you've only got to misplace the genre and you misinterpret the whole thing. And so I think when we come to Old Testament, we've often got it into our heads, this has to work as history or it doesn't work at all. And I've got to defend it as history or it's indefensible. But there are just other genres of literature that exist. There's no use applying the category of history to a psalm, you'll just misread it. And so when I hear statements along the lines that you know, Genesis is history all the way back to Genesis 1 verse 1, it's just simplistic and unrealistic. We need to have a better discussion than that about what sort of literature are we dealing with. It sort of grades into history as time goes on, like the genealogies,
Yes.
stringing ancestry together, that has a historical element. It also has a constructive and creative element, but the further back you go, the more you are disconnecting from human history.
Right. Sorry, I hope I didn't offend anybody by saying that. Okay, I'm looking for questions on Slido or people. Oh, hang on, we've got one here. Could you clarify the Adam word a bit more? The genealogy in Genesis 5 itself treats Adam as an individual.
Yep. So that's quite true. So by 425 and then 5:1, you're using the word without the article, and that has usually, not always, but usually has the connotation of a name. It's being used that way in the genealogy. But already in the beginning of chapter 5, it actually uses it a couple of different ways. It says, when God created male and female, he named them Adam. And so that already can't be a name, even in chapter 5, verse 1. If we had in our Bibles the character called human with a capital H, even once he was, plugged into an ancestor and everything like that, we'd realise, there's something else going on here. And that's what that word means, right? So if we had humankind named his wife Eve, or better, humankind named his wife Life, they had their son Smith, right? Cain means Smith, like as in metalsmith, Down the ancestral chain, you get Enosh. What does that mean? That's another word for humanity. If we actually had in our translations these words, we'd realise that something schematic or, symbolic, paradigmatic is happening, right?
Ooh, okay. I don't think we've got any more questions on Slido. Go ahead.
Sarah, you need to watch the slide because people are voting for questions, which means they go at the top.
Ah.
So you need to just.
Oh. Look, I'll let Neil go, and then I'll go to this
One
one.
of the translations, I can't remember who the guy was, but he tried to do a sort of quite novel translation of Genesis. He uses the word earthly from Adam because it plays on the Adam,
Yes.
Adamah.
Yes, exactly right. Yes, yeah.
And particularly until a partner for the earthling is created, man and woman, as gender terms aren't used.
So we have the trouble, it's another translation problem again, that we have to either choose to make it a proper noun, someone's name, or, a categorical name, a genre, human. Again, the translator has to choose between those things. I think a capitalised H, human, would be the nearest thing to a compromise. But the writer can have this play between category and character. We have trouble transmitting these things into our English. Yeah.
Do you think people get confused about thinking that the person who wrote Genesis was actually all-knowing as they were writing? It is the inspired word of God, but perhaps we think that, the person who wrote it would actually knew the full mind of God.
Yeah, that's right. So I actually think we need a good doctrine of accommodation. And so some of you will be familiar with Calvin and Augustine and the idea of God's self-limitation of his communication. So in divine inspiration of Scripture, which, I'd like to be careful to preserve, we have to have some understanding of how God can communicate with finite beings and must self-limit his speech. And so Calvin famously talks about God kind of lisping like a child to speak to young children, And so the fact that full-blown cosmology in all of its 21st century perfection is not delivered to people 3,000 years ago is a part of God wanting to actually communicate in intelligible terms. So I think theologically there's actually a strong precedent for why God would limit the truth to what's digestible at the time.
This is the top question, which is, quite similar, but is there anything in the Old Testament we should take literally? And how do you handle people who do take everything literally?
Well, I actually think when you're dealing with historical texts, it makes sense to judge them on a literal basis and against historical criteria. So if you're reading about the reign of David, I think you're reading about a historical figure. I think the text is making historical claims, and it makes sense to measure that text against historical criteria and have the debate with a skeptic about it against those standards, historical standards. It doesn't make much sense to judge a non-historical sense by historical standards. So if someone came up to me and said, well, I don't really believe in Jesus' reliability because we have not found archaeological evidence of the Good Samaritan, you'd have to have a conversation with that person about missing the point, right? There's no use taking an inapplicable standard and evaluating a text by that standard. That's why the genre conversation needs to come first. Then if it's historical, it's literal kinds of standards it has to meet.
Charles, sorry.
On the question of history in Genesis 1, doesn't it use the verb consecutive? It's normal historical narrative.
It's normal narrative.
Yeah, so there's something historical about it.
No, I didn't say historical narrative. I said it's normal narrative. So the verb consecutive is used when telling a tale or a fable in the Old Testament as well. It's not just historical narrative. It's any kind of narrative.
Historical?
Sorry?
Would be historical.
Could be. It just means you haven't answered the question about historicity yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a big way jumping the rails the other side.
Yeah, so, you know, when in Jotham's fable about the different kinds of vegetation trying to claim to be king over all the vegetation, right, that has to be told using verb consecutives as well. So it's not an identifier for historical.
Does that mean it's a doctrinal decision, not a translation decision?
No, there are still signals in a text as to whether you're dealing with history or not. It's just not that grammatical form. That's just one clue.
I'm just struck by the parallel when you talk about Adam and the challenges of translating. I was struck by the parallel with the previous speaker, where we have a science fiction story with characters with names like future and hope and human and things like that. And it seems as soon as we step away from the Bible, we're perfectly okay with looking at a character in a story which has a very provocative, very significant name like that, and understanding that this is a character in a story whose name symbolizes and signifies some higher concept. And this is telling a superficial story, but at the same time, this story is trying to communicate the deeper truth, and this name is a connection between those two. So it seems like, step away from Genesis, we have no problem doing that in most works of storytelling.
So I think we're not used to what the writer of Genesis does with it, because it's a bit genre bending, because he's having some historicality in the genre and some non-historicality in the same genre. So the fact that it then descends into a genealogy really strains our brains to know what are we doing with this genre-wise. But it's a cross-cultural problem for us.
But again, that science fiction story, they're talking about LaGuardia Airport and Nigeria, but these are real places, real people.
Yeah.
But we can understand the story that's being told.
Yes. So even a keener problem for Genesis is that it utilises not just known historical locations, but grades into the historical ancestry of Israel there at some point. So it's doing something very clever. We're not quite equipped to deal with how clever it is.
Also some thought it's a hymn history.
Yeah, it is hymn-like. It's hard to prove how it might have been used liturgically, but there's that regularity to it.
Sorry, there was just...
How do you justify Hebrews 1 verse 10? He also says in the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundation of the earth, and in the heavens are the works of your hands. So you would be saying that in the beginning was not the beginning.
Yeah, so what I didn't clarify before was how I see the situation of Genesis 1-2. It's going to sound like I want to have my cake and eat it on that verse, but I actually think it doesn't talk about the vacuum of ontological nothingness. So the fact that Genesis 1-2 would be initial conditions, in my understanding, might make it sound like I'm defending that sort of chaos view, or, you know, that there's a primitive matter there that God uses to create. I don't actually think that. I think what the text is saying is, when it says, and the earth was wild and waste or whatever, I think it's actually the most neutral beginning point that the author has at hand to describe. And so the illustration I've started using is, it's like saying the author began with a blank page and then they created this novel. And then someone being pedantic says, hang on, they didn't really create that novel. I'm pretty sure they got that page from somewhere. Where did the page come from? And the person responding, oh, well, that's not what I meant. You know, like, you know, for all intents and purposes, it created the novel. So it's not that Genesis is saying there was material there, I'm not going to tell you how it got there. It's actually, in the author's terms, it's the nothingest thing he knows how to name. right? That's what I think is the sense of the storyline at the start.
We're going to have to finish in a minute. Got Claire and quick question and then Claire.
We also like the breeding grounds and the rivers. Like, I always wondered in the Garden of Eden where they kind of try to give Euphrates and Tigris and geographic.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting. You know, there's theories about that segment of the story, but it has this groundedness, doesn't it? You know, I think it's talking about, you know, when it says there's gold there, it sounds to be talking about a geographical reality of their present that they know about. You know, you can still go if you're enterprising enough and explore for gold there. So it kind of grounds the whole thing. The surrounding storyline in chapter 2 is more it's less locatable than the rivers, but it really all looks to the east. It looks to the Mesopotamian basin as kind of where the known world sprang to life. And so I do like those authors who talk about, you know, the thing really seemingly pictured in Genesis 1 to 11 is how we got Neolithic civilization in the Mesopotamian basin and leading eventually to Israel. Now, I'd say about that, what I say about land and original matter, it's actually not any point constraining that and saying, oh, so it implies just a local creation or anything like that. No, but when it talks about humanity getting established, it's talking in terms of Neolithic civilization. You know, Cain's raises food pastorally, you know, Cain does grain, Abel does agriculture. You know, these are the two things that form the basis for civilization in the ancient Near East, you know.
Finally, Claire.
I get really passionate about this because I know there are people who I think walked away from faith because they've been told to read the Bible in a way that just seems deeply incongruous at some level. It might be intellectually, it might be intuitively. Where are the creative people? Maybe this is where we need artists and communities that are helping to bring what I see as a collective being needed. Is that happening? I know we heard last night about how stubborn we are and how long change can take. Alison McGrath referred to that, to go these bad ideas that stick around for a long time.
Yeah.
Do you see hopeful signs on the horizon?
Yeah. I would just hold out the Bible Project as, I think, the most hopeful sign. It's artistic, it's accessible, it's very well informed with biblical scholarship, it's contemporary. They're probably minor points for debate, but I've seen nothing that really gives me heartburn there, and I think they're quite strong. So I find that as a hopeful, boundary crossing presentation of a good interpretation to the world.
And then sending it on to Bible college to do the class.
Yeah, when you've got longer to explain. That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrew.